for this series was that I was having a conversation with Michael Gott, and we were talking about the increasing polarization in our country, and we were worried about it. You know, there was this sense of Americans becoming pitted against each other as opposed to feeling like we are one nation. And it's okay to have disagreements, but at some point it becomes toxic. And I was concerned that it was becoming toxic and that I was getting caught up in it. Have any of you found that it's really fun to be righteous and to make other people wrong? Has anyone ever experienced that? Yay, yeah, it seems to be part of human nature. And so once I saw that about myself, then I had to say, what am I not seeing, and what might help me have a more generous, inclusive heart around this, and to be wiser and more compassionate. And so that led to a conversation about what kind of a curriculum could we maybe create and offer here that would help us heal as a country after a very divisive election period. And emotions are still high, and a lot of policies are under intense debate. So in the face of all of this intensity, where can we find the best possible solution for our country collectively? So that's the idea behind this class. It's really the second step in an overall curriculum around healing the heart of America. Now we're in week 2 of this class, and what I want to cover in week 2 is to complete, or at least take the next step forward in your Ideal America exercise. Last week we did some brainstorming. You put a bunch of Post-it notes up on the back wall about your Ideal America. And the idea is it's very hard to co-create a future that works for all of us if we're not very clear about what that means. If we're just staying in this sort of wafty realm, but we're not making it concrete, how do we know which bills we are for, which bills we oppose? How do we know how to have intelligent policy conversations, how to be an engaged citizen? So this class is designed to kind of help us get more concrete about your vision. I'm not going to tell you what you need to believe. You're going to choose what is your vision of an ideal America. We're going to talk about this very high-level theories of justice, 3 primary concepts, and then some different philosophers, and we're going to bring it into application on week 4. So we're in week 2 of this process. We're going to really dig in on the Ideal America exercise today. We're going to refresh on some key points from last week, which will be woven throughout this morning. And then we're going to do some working with the polarity thinking process. This polarity thinking process from Barry Johnson is such a tremendous gift because it finds a way to make both sides partially correct. Now, it's somewhat irritating to realize that you are only partially correct. I am only partially correct. There is a larger truth out there, and that these different contentious viewpoints are each expressing something that we need to consider if we're going to achieve our ideal America. So we're going to be working with the polarity thinking process to help us understand our own perspective better and to understand other people's perspectives better. We're going to also touch on this sort of at summary level what I hope you had a chance to read about utilitarianism and libertarianism, huge philosophical schools that are having an impact to this day in our political realm. And I think as you study these, it's not just for the interest of history that we're studying them. It's because these arguments are still being made today. And as you attune your ear to this conversation, you'll be able to hear, that's a utilitarian argument. I like some things about utilitarian arguments, some things I don't like, and you will have refined what that is through the process of this class and reading the book. Does that make sense? The same thing for libertarianism. Some things you'll probably like, some things you'll probably not be crazy about, and that's as it should be because there is no perfection in any of these theories. All right, refreshing a little bit. We're talking about an ideal America, but it's important to ask ourselves, what do we mean by the word America? What is America? And as I've been wrestling with that question, I've come up with 4 answers at a minimum. So at a minimum, it's these 4 things. It is a geography. So there is a set of national boundaries. There are 52 states, there are certain American territories, and that, from a map standpoint, is the geography of America. But we are more than just a geography. We are also a set of ideals and beliefs about what we stand for. I told the story, I think last week, about George Takei's father. And George Takei and his whole family were in an internment camp, actually 2 different internment camps during World War II. Their crime was being Japanese American. His mother was an American citizen, his father was a Japanese citizen, but they were considered a threat to the country based on national origin or ethnicity, and were therefore interned. And if you read his biography, it's very informative of the perspective of the people inside the camps and what they experienced. But what was most touching to me was after the intern camps were broken up after World War II, there was a period of several years before Japanese Americans were allowed to apply for citizenship again. When the doors opened again, his father, who was not yet an American citizen, applied for citizenship. And George was astonished. Now, George was an American citizen by virtue of having been born here and his mother being an American citizen, but his father was not. And he said to him, "Dad, I don't understand. After everything that happened in the camps, how can you apply for American citizenship?" And he said, "Son, this country is not perfect, but this country is a country of ideals, and I believe in those ideals." I mean, it just chokes you up, doesn't it, to think about that he felt that strongly about the ideals. So we're more than our geography. There's something attractive, something magnetic, something really beautiful about the ideals that this country was founded on. We are also a work in progress. We are a process not yet fulfilled. If we are to list the ideals of America, we could probably fairly quickly find examples of where we're not yet living up to that. Would you agree? Yeah. Does that mean we should give up all hope and become cynical? No. I would say no. I am a firm believer that optimism is a necessary characteristic of the spiritual journey, of the political journey. Optimism is part of how we make the world better. So we have to maintain the belief that it's possible for a better tomorrow. And one way I think about that is America is a process. And we are better than we were, but we are not done. And I need to be part of the process of America. And then fourth, we are who the people are. There's a sense that America is not just ideals, it's not just geography, it's not just this progression towards our ideals, it is also who we are. And the essence of America is generally pretty amazing. Some of you may have seen the news report about the mosque in Victoria, Texas that burned down. Now, I have not heard about cause of the fire. I don't know if they know yet. There are presumptions possible because that mosque has been targeted before that it might have been a hate crime, but we don't know. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. In one sense, it matters a lot because if they have any evidence that it is, then they should go after whoever did it. But in another sense, it doesn't matter because they are our neighbors. You know, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. They are our neighbors, and they're very close physically, geographically to us. So there's sort of a sense of this hits home. They, within 24 hours of that news report, their GoFundMe page had raised more money than they needed to rebuild. Isn't that beautiful? And those donations came from everywhere. It was the beauty of the American heart, the generosity of the American heart, saying, heck no, we're not letting a house of worship become a target. We're really sorry that this has happened to you. This is not what we believe in. This is not what we stand for. Here's some money, please rebuild. And in the meantime, the Jewish synagogue in that community gave them keys to the synagogue and said, please worship in our space until you rebuild. Isn't that beautiful? So to me, that's part of what is America. It's like, you know, we can be jerks, but we can be awesome. And so it's sort of the awesomeness. Let's amplify our awesomeness. Maybe that's our next you know, class title, Amplifying Our Awesomeness.
That's a campaign.
That's a campaign, that's a bumper sticker, Amplify Our Awesomeness. So that's a little reminder of what this series is about and what is America. We introduced a metaphor last week, which is going to be really important for the whole 4 weeks we're together and ongoing for the rest of this curriculum. And that's the metaphor of the elephant and the rider, which I have a little hand-drawn elephant and rider up here as an illustration. And the idea here is that the elephant represents the older parts of our brain. It's our limbic system, which is our fear-based system, but it's also our intuitions, our emotions, our unconscious mind, and maybe even tapping into our collective unconscious. And the rider is our logical mind, our neocortex. Now, we like to believe that we are logical beings. There is no evidence to support this. The dominant decision maker in all of our lives, and I include myself here, is the elephant, our intuitive, emotional gut check about what's right and what's wrong. Now, the elephant gets trained in part by its life experience and by its cultural circumstances. So the elephant can change its positions on things, but it generally does not change its positions on things because you argue with it logically. Has anyone engaged in a Facebook debate that did not go well? This is the problem, right? Because we are arguing at this level when it's this level that's making the decisions. Furthermore, the role of the rider, it turns out, is mostly to act as the press agent for the elephant. So the elephant makes a decision, and then the rider tells everybody why it is so logical that the elephant made the decision it made. Now, this will sound like a whole lot of political debates, right? Because you feel like you're talking past each other, and you really are, because we're not speaking to the elephant. Now, what motivates the elephant to change position is more likely to be relationships of deep care and concern. So one of the examples that I heard recently from Peter Railton from the University of Michigan, who's a really well-respected moral philosopher, he also studies moral psychology, and this metaphor comes from moral psychology. This metaphor was popularized by Jonathan Haidt, a wonderful moral psychologist. Peter Railton was saying that his belief about why we changed as a nation fairly quickly on the issue of LGBT marriage was that so many people came out of the closet so quickly, historically speaking. Within decades, a lot of people came out of the closet and said, you know, hey, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm bisexual, whatever. And so this whole conversation around gender and orientation became very personal. It was no longer theoretical. It became, if I am not in favor of equal rights, I'm hurting my friend Dan or my sister Mary or whomever. It was someone personal. And then the cognitive dissonance gets set up. Am I more attached to my belief, or do I care more about Dan or Mary? And given that, some people will stick with their beliefs, but many people shifted and said, wow, this is personal and I can no longer hold that view. So this tends to speak to the importance of loving relationships and staying in relationship with people even when you disagree with them, which can be very difficult. Now, the rider can influence the elephant if you are not in a state of agitation. When you're calm and you're not scared, logic, you can actually influence your own elephant, right? You can argue with your elephant and convince it that its gut position is wrong. It's hard for somebody else's rider to argue with your elephant, right? But if we talk and I kind of convince your rider on something, or you convince my rider, my neocortex of something, then I can say, okay, that's a prejudice in me that I want to get rid of, and I'm going to work on that. So my rider can work on my elephant. Does that make sense? Right. So we're going to kind of hold these assumptions, and they're important because otherwise it's hard to know how to be a loving community and an engaged citizen if you're operating at the wrong level of the metaphor. All right. We are working through the book, which has 3 themes. The first, the welfare of the people, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. Utilitarianism has a lot to do with trying to maximize the welfare of the people. We are going to be looking at the justice theory around the freedom of the people, which is a relatively modern theory, and libertarianism is probably the most vocal proponent of arguing for the freedom of the people. And then next week, we're going to be looking at Aristotle and virtue ethics and the concept of the teleos of a society. What is the purpose of a good society? So we'll get to that next week. But this week, we're going to practice with polarity thinking, and we're going to look a little bit at those first 2 theories, welfare theory and freedom theory. How are we going to fix our problems? I try to show this slide every time because I think it's a good reminder. There's really, in a sense, a very simple solution, and it's love one another. And if that were easy, we would have already done it by now. It's incredibly hard work. And we're going to be talking about specific ways that we can do it as we use this polarity management, polarity thinking model. Why does love and politics go together? And I think Martin Luther King's comment about power and love is a useful way to think about the importance of governance and love. He talks about power without love is reckless and abusive. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. Does that make sense? Yeah. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Right? So love involves more than just me personally working on myself. There is a collective responsibility here around our social justice system, and that's why this question is so pressing for so many of us. It's like, how do we manage our system of governance so that it can be a governance of love? What's the goal of all of this? Martin Luther King's comment on this is that the end or the goal is reconciliation. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? I am weary. I don't know if you are weary of the argumentation. Are you guys weary of it? And of hating each other and blaming each other and stereotyping each other into boxes of you're a snowflake and an idiot, or you're a Republican and an idiot. I mean, pick your category. You know, we're making everybody into idiots. I would rather not be a society of idiots. I would rather be a society of really intelligent, loving people putting our shoulder to the wheel. If we can reach reconciliation, the end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. And that phrase has very specific meaning to him, which you can research if you would like to. But it essentially is the kind of community I think most of us would like to see. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. So I think it's helpful for us to remember that's why we're here. Right? So how are we going to put love into action? We want to do it wisely, compassionately, peacefully, and we need to engage with people of different perspectives, which I will guarantee you in advance will be highly annoying. So we're going to have to develop a high threshold for discomfort and being annoyed in order to get to the place we want to get to. We went through this definition last week of what is spiritual intelligence. It's the ability to behave with love. It's the ability to behave with wisdom and compassion while maintaining inner and outer peace. So we want a spiritually intelligent society. We'd like to get there. This tool called polarity management is absolutely crucial, I think, for us to heal the current state of America, which is to learn to see the both and of many of these different arguments. And we began the illustration of this with the inhaling and exhaling illustration, which Barry Johnson, who created this model, usually begins with this as his way of explaining it. Now, how many people were not here last week? Okay, just a few. I just want to cover this enough because if you don't understand this, the rest of the exercises make no sense. So the inhaling and exhaling example. For those who were here last week, you don't need to answer, but for those who are new, inhale or exhale, which do you prefer? If you had to choose one, which would you choose? Inhale, inhale. Okay, now if you inhale and hold your breath, what's going to happen? You're going to turn blue, right? And eventually you'll pass out. So there's something non-functional about just picking inhaling. Would exhaling work any better if I just exhaled and held it? No. So there's something necessary about the two of these, and it's not about finding the midpoint. Sometimes people get confused with polarities and say, well, you just stand in the middle, like on a teeter-totter or a seesaw. It's not going to work to just fill your lungs halfway and stop either. This is a dynamic system that has to stay in motion. You must pulse between the poles for this to work. So inhaling brings in oxygen. That's the upside. If you see this over here, this is the positive of inhaling. If you stay here too long, you get the negative or the downside, which is carbon dioxide buildup, which forces you up here to exhale and release carbon dioxide. If you stay there too long, you start the downside of exhale, which is oxygen deprivation, which forces you back up here. So it forms a beautiful infinity loop. Isn't that lovely? I just think that's just so beautiful that it goes on and on like that. It's not about finding a midpoint and staying there. It's about being in the flow. If you insist on sticking to one pole, you're inherently out of the flow. And you're going to get, let me back up, there we go. You're going to get the negative outcome down here, which is in red because it's like, stop, please don't do that. If you insist on one or the other, you will end up dead. Or you'll faint and your body will take over because it figures you're too stupid to manage this, so it'll just take over for you. But if the goal is the North Pole, the green box, staying alive, then that is your reason for managing this polarity. So the green box becomes really important, and it's why we're spending so much time on what is your vision of an ideal America, because when you want to quit, when you want to choke somebody, is going to be the time you need to remember the green box that you write for yourself as we go through this. It is your commitment to a healthy, thriving America, if you're really committed to that, that will give you the heart space and the mind space to listen to the other pole and to consider that your solution might be partial. So this becomes very important to understand the green box at the top. Now, last week we did a little exercise on a healthy family versus a dysfunctional family, and we looked at a simple polarity: do I take care of the other people in my family or I take care of myself? We asked everybody to fill out the top and the bottom on each side. So on the benefits of taking care of others, if I take care of others, the upside of this is that everyone feels loved and supported. Everyone builds trust. They trust that this is a safe space, this family takes care of each other, and that we are stronger as a team. Does that feel true? Right? The concern when people favor the blue pole, and a lot of very good-hearted people favor taking care of others over taking care of self, what they fear is down here. They fear doing too much self-care makes them selfish, bad people, God won't like me, you won't like me, I'll be isolated and lonely, and what ends up happening is they would become isolated, lonely, and therefore angry because they've been too focused on self. So this is what they hope for, this is what they cherish, this is what they fear. This color coding is helpful because it's going to show us as we go through our biases, we have two boxes that we prefer or that we think about all the time, and the other two boxes are our blind spot. So in fact, too much other care creates this part. If I'm always taking care of others and I'm not taking care of myself, I'll end up exhausted, short-tempered, sick, and end up potentially rupturing the very relationships I care most about. Does that make sense? Right. The positive side of taking care of myself is that I'll be energized, inspired, healthy, renewed, creative, all those kind of things. Right? People who focus more on self-care see the benefits, but tend to be blind to the times when they're going over the line and looking to other people like they're selfish. They're focused on the benefits here and the other white box over here of like too much other care is going to make me tired and short-tempered. So the white box on the right tends to see these two white boxes. The blue box on the left tends to see these two blue boxes. This is going to flow through all the rest of everything, so nod that you get this. Okay, good. And the goal is to quit the either-or thinking. Either-or thinking locks us into I'm right, you're wrong, and we get into these debates that never get resolved. All right, so we want to find the and where we can pulse between them. Pulsing between them means I have to be attuned to sense when I've fallen below the line. Below the line, all right? So I've fallen below the line, warning, red. How do I turn this green again and move in the direction of a healthy family? Time to take care of myself. All right? Over here, I've stayed here too long. It's moving into the red zone. It's falling below the line towards a dysfunctional family. I'm just being too selfish. It's time for me to focus on other people for a while. I need to sense and move this to the green above the line zone. Now, when we have a preferred pole, we tend to hang out at the preferred pole too much. And when we hang out at the favorite pole too much, we end up a whole lot of negative is happening, but we're having a blind spot around it. I don't see it, right? And maybe somebody says you need to take care of yourself. You take a one-day spa day. You feel guilty the whole time. You say, this is terrible, I can't do this. And so for you, you're having the experience of it's selfish. And you immediately ricochet back over to your other pole. We have this sort of internal immune system built up to the other pole. And the challenge is to notice that it's our problem and to start working on the elephant around that problem. Now, there are polarities and there are problems. Problems are 2 + 2 = 4. They have a fixed, specific answer. Polarities have no fixed, specific answer, which is a shame. But it's just the way it is, right? So polarities exist, they're unavoidable, they are unsolvable, and they are indestructible. Just like inhaling and exhaling, we are stuck with it as long as we want to stay in our body. We're stuck with it. There can be nested and interlocked polarities, and so there are people who study this and make a living out of consulting around this because this gets really complicated. But we're going to try and keep it at high level for the purpose of this class. In your handout material, if you are a parent or were raised by parents or caregivers, you've probably experienced this polarity. There are parenting theories that lean on the tough side. We need to toughen these kids up. And there are parenting theories that lean towards being tender, nurturing, and supportive. Does this make sense? Right? Can you imagine that there is a plus side to each of these poles and a downside to each? Okay. What I'd like you to do is, there's 3 people to a table, and if anybody's isolated, not got a partner, maybe like you guys could talk together. Try and fill this out. We'll just spend about 4 or 5 minutes. Get at least one idea in each of the 4 boxes, and then let's talk about it. What would be the upside of being tough and challenging as a parent? When would it be too much? What would happen if you did it too much? You only are tough, you're never nurturing. And then what's the upside of being nurturing, and what's the downside of only ever being tender and nurturing and never ever being tough? Get the idea? Okay. Just at your tables, why don't you try and fill this out? All right, let's talk about this. And I'll just let you shout out some stuff and I'll repeat it so everyone can hear it. So if you raise your hand, I'll call on people. Give me something positive about being a tough parent, a challenging parent. Give me something positive. Yes?
Become responsible.
So the young person becomes responsible. So the idea here, I'm going to ask, is that if I am tough on them and hold them accountable, they'll learn the lessons they need to learn to be responsible citizens. Is that the idea? Okay. Okay, develop leadership qualities, be respectful. You learn that your actions have consequences. Develop a compass, your inner core, by learning how to sort of stand up for yourself in the face of some resistance. High standards leading to, and here's, I'm going to put words in your mouth, genuine self-esteem, okay? Tenacious. So you're building something in the child that says, you got to keep going, you got to keep going. Okay, so I'm going to put tenacious. We learn to bear discomfort. Stress tolerance. All right, let's talk about the downside of being tough. You're tough to excess. You're only ever tough, yes. Love felt conditional to you in this extreme tough love environment, that you had to earn it, that you weren't lovable.
It wasn't because of who I am, it was because of what I did.
You were not inherently lovable. You did not feel you had support, so the nurturing was not there. And you had to learn to be sneaky to get anything done because the consequences were so out of proportional. Rigid, inflexible thinking. Does not teach new behavior. Contracted and avoidant, maybe. Creates fear and sort of constant self-doubt of like, am I going to get in trouble? Or oppositional defiant behavior, maybe not the disorder. Fear of failure and risk. So it kind of shuts down innovation or any willingness to kind of take on life maybe more creatively. So they might be excessively self-protective as an adult, which could make it really hard to form relationships, friendships, things like that. Inability to have their own voice or stand up to a bully because they're just too cowed. Their general demeanor is, yeah, to stand up to bullies so that they are disempowered. Too much tough love can lead to isolation and loneliness. So there could be difficulties forming attachment, difficult to attach because you don't feel safe. Stifled self-expression perpetuates anger. Now the fact that there is so much energy on the downside of tough leads me to believe it's possible that this room leans towards nurturing. It's just possible. All right, let's talk about being tender or nurturing. What's the upsides of being tender or nurturing? Compassionate, knows and feels that they are lovable. They become more open and creative. They develop self-worth. Their empathy, which is naturally present, develops. Encourages flexibility versus the more rigid disciplinarian model. They learn to trust. So there's this sense from an early age that I can lean on you and you will be there for me. So there's an ability to form close personal relationships. So there's sort of the freedom to discover their spirituality internally, yeah, versus told. Learn to trust that they can solve the problem. Okay to fail. That you can pick yourself up and try again. Generous, become generous. And nurturing and giving, all of those things. Physical vitality from all this appropriate, hopefully, nurturing. All right. Now, this one might be a little more difficult. Thank you, dear. What's the downside of only ever being nurturing and tender and never ever being tough? Okay, let's get some. Yes. Not able to set appropriate boundaries. to set, and that comes to the toughness aspect, is toughness around setting boundaries. There's an appropriateness to that. And so if you don't know how to be tough, you're basically a wimp. Is that kind of, okay, not able to set boundaries. Not able to turn dreams into reality. And this is sort of it's all fine to imagine it, but you haven't learned how to toughen up and deal with the world. And too much daydreaming, not enough drive and knowledge of how to get it done. Right, so the parent may not have provided enough discipline to train it into the child, and at some point we can all take over and do our own work, right, once we're old enough. Overly compromising, is this coming from being conflict avoidant and wanting to always be nice? Is that part of this? Too nice. Avoiding conflict. Smothering. The smother mother. If you watch the Goldbergs, that's what the kids call their mother, our smother. Our smother. Emotional immaturity. Maturity and entitlement. Isn't this a complaint we're hearing a lot from bosses these days about their younger employees? Codependency. Don't take responsibility for their actions. So your natural style is either going to lean towards the blue, where you're going to be tending towards tough and challenging. You're going to see the benefits of that. You're going to fear everything we just described about the wimpy little arrogant, obnoxious kids that get created by nurturing parents. But you're going to tend to be blind to the excessive toughness and the damage that it can do. And you will also tend to be blind to the benefits of nurturing at the right time. Right? Now, if you lean towards nurturing, you're going to have a whole lot of energy, as we saw, for what happens when you're too tough. Didn't we have a lot of energy around that? When you're too tough on your kids, you can break their spirits, blah, blah, blah. You'll tend to see the benefits of this, but you may be blind to the damage you cause when you're excessively nurturing and letting kids off the hook too much. And you may be blind to the benefits of being a tough love kind of parent. Make sense? This is really important. So why would you bother to reconcile these? The love of your child can motivate you to reconcile these. The green box, I love my child so much that I am willing to overcome my natural bias for the service of this child. So the challenge is to put the and in the middle of this, in learning when to do each of these in appropriate balance. As we go through polarity mapping, as we map these very difficult, some of our very difficult political topics, and we'll get to that in week 4, what I want you to remember is everyone has hopes and everyone has fears. The person who favors tough love has these hopes for their child and these fears for their child. And the person who believes in being a tender and nurturing parent has these hopes for their child and these fears for their child. Doesn't that humanize this? Yes. So one of the ways we can bridge our differences is to change how we have the conversation. What are your hopes and what are your fears? And most likely, if we can really have that conversation, we'll have some common ground. And then we have to focus on the goal, the green box, the North Pole, and find what we have in common. If two parents were having this argument, they could reach a reconciliation of what to do around the goal of loving the child. Given this child's temperament, given this child's context, what is the loving thing to do for this child in this moment? I think it's time she felt some consequences. Well, no, I think we've been pretty tough on her lately. I think it's time we let this one go and tell her we love her no matter what. And those are both beautiful possibilities. And I have heard this from many parents who lean toward the nurturing side, that life is tough enough, it doesn't need to be tough inside the house. Now, the argument from the tough side is, because life is tough, it needs to be tough inside the house. Does that make sense? So you can reach a different conclusion both from a loving position. And is either one always right? No. Is either one always wrong? No. That's kind of the beauty of the model. It is the nature of life to flow. It is not the nature of nature to be rigid, right? So it's almost like we're aligning with spirit, we're aligning with nature, we're aligning with wisdom and love and compassion as we think about it this way with an orienting principle at the top in the green box. There is a context that this is always embedded in, and context matters a tremendous amount. We're teaching this in a very simplified form so that we can build, you know, from this. But you're absolutely right. If you're engaged in a game of survival where your physical survival day to day is threatened, you might bias this towards the tough side because otherwise there's kind of no point if the child won't live to see tomorrow. So it does depend if you are in a war-torn region, that might impact how you answer this question. We are in a very privileged place living in this society. While we criticize it, we are free to criticize it. You know, that in and of itself is a tremendous privilege. And we have the ability to think these thoughts because for most people, it's not a question of day-to-day survival for most people. So Alice Miller's books are fabulous, Drama of the Gifted Child and For Your Own Good. And there's a spiral dynamics implication to a lot of this. One of the contexts is what is the spiral level that's dominant in the society at that time. If we can just learn to pulse a little bit between two poles on a few topics, we'll have done the world a great service. So we'll take this elephant one bite at a time. We'll take on our own prejudices and our own biases and our own internal maturity one bite at a time. In this world of spiral dynamics, it was an interesting segue. Thank you for that, because that was the next slide. One of the things Don Beck always says, and Don is the sort of spiral dynamics integral guy who co-authored the book Spiral Dynamics with Chris Cohen. He talks about how do you bring a society back together in the face of craziness like we're dealing with, and he had a lot of experience working with South Africa as they were dismantling apartheid. And one of the challenges is to find what he calls the superordinate goal, a goal around which we can unify the green box on the polarity map. What is it that we both are willing to get behind that could cause us to bridge our differences even a little bit, to find common cause with each other? And I think that's a challenge for our society right now. All right, so let's get back to the green box. Your most important thing is figuring out your green box. Michael and I have joked about this saying, which I think is fabulous. What starts in vagueness stays in vagueness. Little pun there on the vagueness thing. It's hard to co-create a future that works for all if you can't really envision what that means. I mean, that phrase, co-creating a future that works for all, which is one that we often use around here, is a beautiful phrase, but it's not very granular, it's not very specific. But even having that's a start. The more granular and specific you can get, the more you can tell when you're deviating from your ideal America and focus on the America you want to co-create. So for that reason, I want you to spend a little bit of time now working an exercise on your ideal America. What we're going to do first is I want to point out this spreadsheet. Some of you got here early and had a chance to work on it earlier. This is the result of our gratitude exercise last week. What do you love about America? What is the best about America? And so all those little Post-it notes that were at the back wall, we typed them up. Carrie was kind enough to type these up for us. And she counted them when there were identical Post-it notes or almost identical Post-it notes. So the count is in the right-hand column. So the highest vote getter was around the topic of diversity, which had 19 Post-it notes, some of them having various comments on them like nationalities, beliefs, opinions, ideas, and so on. I find myself sometimes forgetting how important Maslow's hierarchy is for thinking about what we want to protect about this country. For example, Sandy's very recent comment about the context matters. I often forget about the physiological and survival needs that are not necessarily being met for every single person in the country, and I would like them all to be met, you know? So what do I care about in my ideal America at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy? What do I care about in terms of safety needs? So you got physiological needs at the bottom, you got safety needs next. You've got belongingness and love needs above that. You've got self-esteem needs above that, the desire to learn and understand, the desire for beauty, art, music, and inspiration, the desire for self-actualization, and the desire for self-transcendence. So take a minute and let's populate this side of the page. Your ideal America, what would you like to see covered in each of these? The more concrete you can get about your vision for an ideal America, the more you can take it into your prayer life, the more you can take it into your citizenship life, both voting and other forms of engagement as citizens. You'll be able to be much more intentional. I'd like to move into a quick summary of the utilitarianism and libertarian chapters that I asked you, if you had a chance to please read from the book. What you'll see is that this is a polarity. There's probably more than one, but there's certainly this polarity at play when you're looking at the utilitarian versus libertarian argument. The utilitarians are essentially arguing to measure collective happiness, and that the best way to create a good society and a just society is to maximize the happiness of the people who live in that society. Each of these arguments makes sense on their surface, and as we'll see, each of these arguments have weak points and places where they can go to excess, all right, which is why polarity mapping is very helpful, because over time we'll be able to put what are the positives of focusing on the collective happiness and where does it go to excess, what are the weaknesses, and what are the benefits of focusing, as the libertarians do, on the freedom and rights of the individual, and what's the negative of over-focusing on the freedom and rights of the individual. Sound like a useful frame? Okay. And of course, we want to be able to put the and in the middle because there's truth on both sides. So utilitarianism, let's talk about that for a moment. Jeremy Bentham is the most famous founder of this thought process. He started his life in 1748, died in 1832. And his belief, and it was really pretty step out for its time, was the highest principle of morality is to maximize happiness, the overall balance of pleasure over pain. And if you maximized everybody's happiness, you were maximizing utility, as he called it. Now, if you think about ancient societies where maybe only the happiness and pleasure of the monarch and the court mattered, this is kind of stepping out there, saying that all citizens, the pleasure and pain of all citizens are now going to be factored into what makes a just society. So there's some really stepping forward thinking with this. And there's an effort to put the writer in charge, the logical mind in charge. We're going to turn this into a math problem, and we're going to figure it out. So we're going to put everything on the scale of what's going to maximize happiness. Somehow we have to put numbers to this. Often it's converted into dollars. His belief is that pleasure and pain, since we are basically organic beings, animals, are our sovereign masters, and that any standard of right and wrong has to be fastened to that throne. So pleasure and pain is sort of the thing. And then the math, how do you do the math? A utilitarian can be for or against torture. Now I just want you to notice what your elephant's doing right now. Is your inner elephant going yuck? If your inner elephant's going yuck, just notice that, because we have gut reactions to things, and that's important information. As I talked last week, sometimes the elephant is just blindly prejudiced, but sometimes the elephant carries instinctive wisdom. And we sort of have to sort through which it is. And the best way to sort through is when we're not upset. Sort of calm down and think about things. But if you're having a negative reaction, just notice your elephant's reacting to that. A utilitarian can be for or against torture based on the practicality. One question they would ask is, does it work? If we're having a bomb threat and we torture somebody who's a suspect and we get information that saves lives, doesn't that maximize the utility of the society? Yeah, one person suffered terribly, but we saved a lot of lives. So it becomes, like I said, it's often a math problem. How much suffering for how much gain? All right. But you can expand the math so that it's not just short term. You can say, okay, maybe in the short term we got some benefit, but in the long term, will our soldiers then be subject to torture if they are captured in wartime? And maybe we want to have an agreement with all these other countries that we don't torture so that our soldiers are okay. So there's like still a cost-benefit analysis, but it's a more expansive cost-benefit analysis. Make some sense? Right? So they go through a couple of examples. The ticking time bomb scenario is a very common one, and they talk about, again, hundreds of thousands of people could die, but I'm going to torture this one person who's a suspected terrorist. Now, sort of the gut reaction that people will often have is, well, if they're a terrorist, they're a bad guy anyway, so who cares? But that's not a utilitarian argument, right? Because utilitarians are just doing math. That's an elephant making a statement about the relative worth of a life because the person is a bad person. And they say, well, let's just take a different stance. Let's say the terrorist's daughter, who has had nothing to do with this, she's 6 years old. If I torture her to get the terrorist to talk, now how do you feel about it? Ooh, did your elephant just really get unhappy about that? Yeah, my elephant gets really unhappy about that. So these are interesting questions to help us think, what do I believe and why do I believe it? There's also an example about smoking and Philip Morris making a really bad decision about, if you remember that story, about the relative dollar value of one human life versus the cost to society of caring for the elderly, and if people kill themselves smoking, it actually saves society money. They figured out that that was a terrible way to explain themselves based on the reaction they got to that. You can read the details in the book. So there's a couple of critiques of utilitarianism, one of which is it's not giving adequate weight to human dignity, and the second of which is that it is wrongly reducing everything to scales of pleasure and pain, and often dollars and pounds in terms of currency. The problem that utilitarians often run into, the collateral damage that is not factored in, it's nearly impossible in a highly complex world to get the math right. There's just so many variables and complexity of systems that no matter how hard you try, it's really hard to get this math right. Bentham received a lot of negative feedback, pushback on some of his philosophy, and John Stuart Mill tried to come to the rescue. He tried to reconcile the concept of utilitarianism with the idea of individual rights, and he made a statement about independence is as a right absolute. So everyone has the right to be independent, but how you can make that argument from a utilitarian standpoint is kind of an argument that's hard to sustain. So the criticism is that he's respecting individual rights because it advances society, but once you make the argument that the only reason to respect individual rights is because it's good for society, if you can create a society that benefits by suppression of rights, you've then justified the suppression of rights. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of a weak place to stand on. Libertarianism, fascinating perspective, tends to endorse unfettered markets and opposes government restrictions and regulations pretty much all the time. It's not an argument so much around economics as it is around freedom. They are the absolute ideologues for freedom. Freedom, 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 freedom. So their minimal government perspective is that there's only 3 roles that government should take, which is enforcing contracts, protecting property, and keeping the peace. In other words, police and military in order to keep the peace. Any other purpose of government, they will generally disallow if they're purists, including roads, bridges, things like that. So it becomes an interesting conversation about how do you fund the infrastructure of a society if you're a pure libertarian. So I'll leave it to you to read up on that if you haven't read it. They hate paternalism, so they hate any regulation around things like seatbelts and safety because the government knows what's good for you. I will choose, they will say, whether or not to risk my own life. Now, the utilitarian could come back and say, wait a minute, every time you bloody yourself on the highway because you rode a motorcycle without a helmet, you're costing all the rest of us having to come try and rescue you and clean up the mess. And their argument might be, let me die. I made that choice. If I splatter myself on the highway, don't come rescue me. How's your elephant feel? Not liking it too much, yeah. So it's an interesting perspective, but how far can you take it? They are very much opposed to regulating morality. Do not tell people whom they can have sex with. Do not try to regulate prostitution, for example. So those would be things they would say, get out of that business. That is not government's job. Individual freedom is paramount. and no redistribution of income or wealth. Wealth is different than income in that wealth could be inherited, for example. It's not necessarily an income. Taxes are generally perceived by libertarians as theft. They have very strongly held opinions about taxes, and they will say that most of what we are taxed for is redistribution, taking care of other people, or taking care of infrastructure that it's not the government's job to take care of. So it's an interesting perspective. Libertarians are not really Republicans or Democrats. It's really kind of a third entity of its own. They have some things that overlap with Democrats and some things that overlap with Republicans. They will generally argue against factoring in the social good. So they will be opposed to utilitarianism. You've got the libertarians arguing for the freedom of the individual, and you've got the utilitarians arguing for the collective happiness, and we'll look a little more at this next week. And how do we find the end? Another way you can think about this is that libertarians are focused on me and my freedoms, and utilitarians are looking at the we. So how much me and how much we is actually a central debate in a lot of our policy issues these days. Next week, I would like you to please read chapter 6 and chapter 8. Skip over 7, I'll summarize it for you. 7 is Kant. Kant tends to explode people's brains. Feel free to read it if you would like, but I would ask you to please read 6, which is on John Rawls, and 8, which is on Aristotle. And then on our final week, so we'll do that next week, and then our final week, we're really going to dig into some current policy issues and use polarity mapping. So we'll use polarity mapping again next week, and we'll really dig in on current policy issues on week 4.